It was the summer of 2015 when I experienced the most terrifying night of my life. I was a college student at the time, working a summer job in a small town in upstate New York. My name is Mark Stevenson, and back then, I was 22, trying to save up for the next semester. This particular night, July 15th, began like any other, but it ended in a way I'll never forget. I had just finished my shift at a local diner around 11 p.m. The roads were mostly empty as I made my way back home. It was a long, winding route through dense woods, and I usually enjoyed the solitude and the cool night air. As I drove, the headlights of my old Toyota Corolla slicing through the darkness, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, thumb outstretched. It was unusual to see hitchhikers around here, especially so late at night. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. As I got closer, I saw it was a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with long dark hair and a look of desperation in her eyes. She wore a tattered dress and clutched a small backpack. "Hey, need a ride?" I called out, rolling down the window. She nodded vigorously, looking relieved. "Yes, please. I'm trying to get to the next town over. My car broke down." Something about her story didn't sit right with me, but she seemed genuinely distressed. I unlocked the door, and she climbed in, thanking me profusely. "I'm Charlotte," she said, offering a shaky smile. "Mark," I replied, glancing at her as I started driving again. The car filled with an uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle from her backpack. We drove for a few miles, and I tried to make small talk. She seemed distracted, her answers short and evasive. My unease grew, but I dismissed it as paranoia. It was just a ride, after all. Around midnight, we reached a desolate stretch of road flanked by thick forest on either side. Charlotte's behavior became increasingly erratic. She kept glancing out the window, her fingers drumming nervously on her knees. I decided to break the silence. "So, what happened to your car?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "It just stopped," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't get it to start again." "Do you need to call someone? I have a phone," I offered. She shook her head quickly. "No, it's fine. I just need to get to the next town." A few minutes later, she suddenly asked me to pull over. "I need to use the restroom," she said, her voice trembling. "Out here?" I asked, surprised. We were in the middle of nowhere. "Please, it's urgent," she insisted. Reluctantly, I pulled over to the side of the road. She jumped out of the car and disappeared into the trees. I watched the darkness swallow her up, my unease growing into full-blown anxiety. Minutes ticked by and she didn't return. I got out of the car and called out, "Charlotte, are you okay?" No response. I waited a bit longer, but the silence was deafening. Something was very wrong. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and ventured into the woods, calling her name. As I moved deeper into the forest, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There, lying among the leaves, was her backpack. It was open, its contents scattered, a few clothes, a wallet, and a photograph. I picked up the photo, my hands shaking. It showed Charlotte with a man, both smiling at the camera. On the back, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Charlotte and Alex forever." I heard a rustling sound behind me and spun around, the flashlight illuminating a pair of eyes watching me from the shadows. It was Charlotte, but her demeanor had completely changed. She looked feral, her eyes wild and her posture menacing. "Charlotte, what's going on?" I demanded, my voice barely steady. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer, and I noticed a glint of metal in her hand. A knife. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. Her face twisted into a sinister smile. "I needed a way out," she hissed, "and you were convenient." Before I could react, She lunged at me. I managed to dodge, the knife grazing my arm. Pain shot through me, but adrenaline kept me moving. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I didn't stop until I reached the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps pounding on the dirt. My car was just ahead, the driver's door still open. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it just as she reached the car. Her face appeared at the window, twisted in rage. She pounded on the glass, screaming incoherently. I started the engine, my hands trembling, and floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched as I sped away, leaving her standing in the middle of the road. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my mind racing. I explained everything to the officers, who immediately dispatched a search team to the area. I stayed at the station, giving my statement over and over, my fear slowly giving way to exhaustion. The police searched the woods for hours but found no trace of Charlotte. Her backpack, the photograph, and the scattered belongings were the only evidence that she had ever been there. They found no sign of her car or any indication of where she might have gone. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation yielded no new leads. Charlotte had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a chilling mystery. The photograph haunted me, her smiling face a stark contrast to the horror of that night. I returned to college, but I was never the same. The memory of Charlotte and the terror I experienced stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I had come to danger. I often wondered who she really was and what had driven her to such desperate measures. Years later, I heard a rumor about a woman matching Charlotte's description who had been involved in a string of hitchhiker attacks across the state. She would lure unsuspecting drivers into secluded areas and rob them, sometimes violently. The stories varied, but one thing was clear: she was dangerous. I never found out what happened to her or who the man in the photograph was. The police eventually closed the case, citing a lack of evidence. But for me, the memory of that night on July 15th, 2015 remains vivid and terrifying. I still drive that same route sometimes, always with a sense of unease. Every time I pass the spot where I picked her up, I feel a chill run down my spine. The woods seem darker, the night more oppressive, and I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing by the roadside waiting for her next victim. It was the summer of 2018, and I was working as a delivery driver for a small logistics company. My name is Chris Daniels, and I was 27 at the time. The job took me to remote and often desolate locations, which I usually didn't mind. I enjoyed the solitude and the open road. But one night in particular, June 12th, changed my perspective on late-night drives forever. I had just completed a delivery in a small town in northern Nevada. It was around 11 p.m., and I had a long drive ahead of me to get back home. The night was pitch black, with only the occasional distant howl of a coyote breaking the silence. As I drove along a lonely stretch of highway, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. The man was tall and thin, dressed in a long black coat that seemed out of place for the warm summer night. He had a scruffy beard and wild hair, his eyes hidden in the shadows. He stuck out his thumb, signaling for a ride. I hesitated for a moment but decided to stop. I figured he must have been in some kind of trouble to be out here alone so late. "Need a lift?" I called out, rolling down the window. "Yes, please," he replied, his voice gravelly. "I'm trying to get to the next town." He climbed into the passenger seat, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. "Name's Chris," I said, trying to break the tension. "Where are you headed?" "Joe," he said simply. "Just to the next town," like I said. We drove in silence for a few miles. Joe didn't seem interested in conversation, staring out the window with a distant look in his eyes. I couldn't help but notice the way he fidgeted with his coat, as if hiding something. My curiosity got the better of me. "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here so late?" I ventured. "Got stranded," he replied curtly. Just need to get somewhere safe." His vague answers did nothing to ease my nerves. I decided it was best to focus on the road and get him to his destination as quickly as possible. The highway stretched endlessly before us, the darkness pressing in from all sides. It was around midnight when things took a turn for the worse. Joe suddenly asked me to pull over. "I need to make a call," he said, his tone demanding. "There's no signal out here," I replied, glancing at my phone. "We can stop at a gas station in a few miles." "Pull over," he repeated, more forcefully this time. I complied, feeling a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Joe stepped out of the car, disappearing into the darkness. I watched him nervously, my mind racing. What was he up to? After a few minutes, he returned, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, fine," he muttered, climbing back in. "Let's go." As we continued driving, I noticed Joe's demeanor had changed. He seemed more agitated, glancing around nervously. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. But then, out of nowhere, he lunged at me, grabbing the steering wheel and yanking it hard to the right. The car swerved violently, tires screeching as we veered off the road and into the desert. I fought to regain control, but it was too late. We crashed into a ditch, the impact jolting us both. My head hit the steering wheel, and for a moment everything went black. When I came to, Joe was gone. The passenger door was open, and he had vanished into the night. My heart pounded as I scrambled to get out of the car, my head throbbing. I looked around, trying to spot him in the darkness, but he was nowhere to be seen. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but as expected, there was no signal. Panic set in as I realized how isolated I was. I started walking back towards the highway, hoping to flag down a passing car. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights in the distance. I waved frantically and the car slowed to a stop. An older couple rolled down the window, looking concerned. "Are you all right, son?" the man asked. "I need help," I gasped. "A man attacked me. He's still out there." They let me in, and we drove to the nearest town. I explained everything to the local sheriff, who organized a search for Joe. They found my car, but there was no trace of him. The sheriff took my statement, but without any solid evidence, there was little they could do. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept seeing glimpses of a figure in a black coat out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. I started to think I was losing my mind. A week later, I received a call from the sheriff. They had found a body in the desert, not far from where we had crashed. It was Joe. He had been dead for days, likely from exposure. They found a knife in his coat pocket and a notebook filled with ramblings about being followed and needing to escape. The news brought some relief, but also more questions. Who was Joe, really? What had driven him to such desperation? The sheriff speculated that he might have been a fugitive, but there was no way to know for sure. The experience left me shaken, and I couldn't bring myself to drive that route again. I quit my job and moved back to the city, hoping to put the ordeal behind me, but every now and then, I still see that black coat in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the night I gave a ride to a man who would haunt me forever. It's been years since that night, but the memory is still vivid. I've shared my story with a few close friends, but they often think I'm exaggerating or letting my imagination run wild. Maybe I am, but I know what I experienced, and I know that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who look just like us.